Hi, and welcome back to The Common Sensei. We're at episode number 6, and the theme for today is A Useful Theory of Wokeness by a Man. A mansplanation of wokeness, I hear you say? Are you mad? I may be, but here goes. And whether you identify as woke or anti-woke, you're on one side of an argument that, as far as I can tell, is not getting resolved anytime soon. And so, here I'm offering a perspective that I hope might create a better platform for the conversation, even though it comes from a man. Now, if you're a fan of Monty Python, which probably means, like me, you were at high school in the 80s, with some exceptions, you might remember Miss Anne Elk's Brontosaurus theory. Here's the relevant clip.
Ready? My theory by A. Elk, brackets, Miss brackets. This theory goes as follows and begins now. All brontosauruses are thin at one end, much thicker in the middle, and then thin again at the far end. That is my theory. It is mine and belongs to me, and I own it and what it is too.
So my original reason for using that as an intro to this piece was to self-deprecate what I'm about to do, which is offer my theory on what wokeness is, where it comes from, and what it might mean for us, how we might improve the conversation around it. I would be like, here's my theory on wokeness, it is mine, and it may be as ridiculous as Anne Elk's Brontosaurus theory, and it may not be, but it is mine. But when I watched the original version on YouTube to make sure I was getting the quote right, I realized that the skit has a whole lot more relevance to the subject than I'd realized. In fact, I'd say it was quite a synchronistic find, and I'll explain that later. So here's my theory about woke thinking. Woke thinking is academic thinking embedded into our daily discourse. Let me explain. Or, if you prefer, mansplain. Last year, I signed up for a master's degree. A proper one, my wife, who has a proper PhD, reminds me. It's been years since I did any formal academic studying, so long in fact that I had to start from scratch with academic writing and referencing. The one thing I noticed very quickly is how much you can't say, at least not without referencing somebody else having said it first. As someone who is used to writing the way that I am speaking here, which is expressing my opinions on a blog or in a newsletter, that was tough. I moaned about it on the family WhatsApp group and discovered that the young adults whom we call our children, all of whom are at university, knew all about this and were quite familiar with it. They had been doing academic writing since school. They were even able to help me with my referencing. Dad alert. In other words, I'm now going to sound like a dad. When I was at school, there was little to no academic writing. We were free to express our opinions. Even at university, as part of a bachelor's degree, we learned the basics of academic writing, but we weren't required to do too much of it. Later on, as a journalist, I could also write quite freely. But now, as I kept hearing that phrase inside my head, but you can't say that unless you can reference it, I began to feel that I'd heard it somewhere else before. Then it dawned on me. I had heard it, in conversation. I couldn't say which ones exactly, but it echoed in my head as having been heard many times. But you can't say that. Then I remembered a time when that phrase was said out loud. It was back in the 90s when people, usually liberal intellectuals like me, would actually stop each other in conversation by using that phrase and then correct them. It wasn't a big deal if someone did it to you because we were genuinely engaging in dialogue, and that came as part of the dialogue. The person who said it was equally struggling with the topic. They were just coming at it from a more objective point of view. Except sometimes. Sometimes you got people who were over-identified with their liberal objectivity and got all high and mighty on you, as some people might feel that woke folk do to them today. But these days you can't say that. You can't say what I've just said. Why? Because it's a generalization. In today's conversation, you'd have to say which person said that, and when, and how many times, and how many people said it, how often, for my statement to be meaningful. And could you even say that they were struggling with the topic because they're not here to defend themselves? Besides which, you have no studies, no references to back that up. And these days, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't say what I've just said. At least not overtly. You wouldn't need to. The other person, who has also been through years of academic rigor, would have the same mindset, And so, in anticipation of their response, you would already have thought all that, would already be qualifying your original claim, adjusting your warrant, providing your own rebuttal, and bringing in new data, new references, all automatically, inside your head, from so many years of academic writing and thinking. And then you would speak. And that's why I say that woke thinking is academic thinking embedded into our conversation. So in other words, we no longer explicitly say, well, you can't say that. It's implied, it's embedded, it's taken for granted. And that, I realized, is how woke conversations go. And they belong, I'm generalizing, to students of the liberal arts of sociology. And here is where the world is becoming divided, I say. It's not between the woke and the unwoke. It's between the liberal arts educated and the non-liberal arts educated. And if we look at the demographics of progressive versus conservative political supporters, I'll bet that we'll find a lot of that in the divide. Now there's a statement you can't make without a reference, and I just did. Ha. So as I've progressed through my studies, I came across another factor for wokeness that needs to be added to the above academic style of thinking as a factor. And this one I can reference. This factor is a philosophical or knowledge or learning framework called social constructionism. I feel the academic pressure away as I start to speak, all those marking pens poised. Social constructionism can be described as a worldview or perspective that suggests, notice my academic phrasing, that how someone sees the world is not objective or neutral or common sense, even though they themselves may insist that it is, references below. The way each of us sees the world is influenced or constructed by the historical and social context, or socio-economic power structure, if you prefer, that we find ourselves in. Now I'll go back into dad mode. I'll mansplain and tell you why and how this is significant. I grew up in South Africa during apartheid. I received my exposure to the liberal perspective quite early in life. You can't say that. My best friend, who came from a liberal academic family, told me that when I was 11. What he said made sense to me and I took it on. Later, I got exposed to another liberal approach, and it was this: stopping to listen to the stories of the victims and not seeing it through my lens but theirs, which meant first recognizing that I had a lens at all. Here's how it happened. At the end of my first year at university, I hitchhiked to Cape Town for my summer holidays. In South Africa, Cape Town is liberal central as San Francisco is to America. And the university, UCT, is Cape Town's progressive liberal beating heart. I stayed with a friend of a friend in a student commune, and one day we got into a conversation about apartheid. I expressed my rather pragmatic and ultimately, I discovered, quite uninformed point of view. And I say that because he corrected me with a story about a person which served as an example of what really happens on the ground in the lives of black people. No, I don't remember the details. I remember the moment clearly, because in order to accept what he was saying, I had to recognize my own worldview, which was that we all make our own reality, and if we complain, then we are being, well, victims. And I saw that black people couldn't do that in the way that I did, because they didn't have the freedoms that I did. I'm kind of simplifying it for the sake of brevity. The point being that I had to see that my own view was constructed by having been brought up white in South Africa. So I could say I became semi-woke in that moment, before woke was a thing. It certainly changed my life and made me the Guardian reader that I am today. My son teases me about that. However, I will add that I'm not a supporter of the way that this social constructionist philosophy gets applied today in the form of the oppression Olympics, as some have called it, where a person's view is necessarily less valid the more privileged they've been, where it's assumed that you can't have any real understanding of another person, although you are required to have that understanding, unless you've actually lived their experience. I think we are capable of more than that. And so to my next point. And here's the irony I find with woke folk. And by the way, I'm no longer in dad mode, I'm in coach mode. So woke folk, by definition, have woken up to the way that the social power constructs have shaped their thinking. Their thinking before they became woke, that is. But once they've seen this and become woke, they seem, and yes, I'm generalizing, to operate as if the rule no longer applies to them, as though they've freed themselves from being subject to a social constructionist viewpoint, that evil viewpoint that keeps social power structures in place. They, the more self-righteous among them, let's say, appear to believe that it no longer applies to them. And then, no different from people who found religion or any other belief, those self-righteous woke folk believe they have found the right answer, which of course, in their minds, they have. After all, they're saying all the right things, all the things you can say. They even have the references to back it up. Meanwhile, out on the street are the uneducated masses, meaning not educated in those particular sociological concepts. And they're trying to speak what's on their mind without having to reference it, or limit it to the sociological studies that have been done and what has been proven or declared true by the academic body of knowledge. To the mind of the woke, those people out there are wrong. And of course they are. If they were to write a paper about it, they'd fail. And having failed, they'd be cancelled. So in the field of coaching, which is what I'm studying, there is a great divide between the academic and non-academic practitioners in the field, and that divide is getting wider. Even the academics acknowledge that. I could provide some references. Some academics are proposing philosophical frameworks that they hope can bring the two sides together. They're extremely complicated papers to read. You have to twist your brain into a pretzel to understand them. I have a simpler solution. To the non-academics, I say, you have to be willing to have your ideas tested, because that's really where academic thinking is good. It forces you to test your ideas, to not come up with crazy notions and make false claims. But to the academics on the other side, I say, listen, open your minds to what is being said that doesn't have a reference. It's often valid. And one day, if you work together, you might create the reference. And I have the same message for the woke and the non-woke folk out there. For the non-woke, let your ideas be tested, because that, after all, is what academic thinking does. It forces you to test your ideas. And for the woke, I say, listen to those unreferenced ideas. So in other words, let each other in. And I'll say more about this in future missives, in future videos. So back to the beginning. Now you've heard my theory. As you can see, it's a Brontosaurus kind of a theory. Funny, but not. A work in progress. Some of it referenced, some obvious, some intuited. And I also said how the Monty Python Brontosaurus theory skit was more apt than I had realized. Well, if you go and watch the whole thing, or watch it again if you have already, and here's the link, this link below, and see if you can pick up all the subtle digs at the academic mindset. For example, whenever the interviewer says it, Anne Alk asks for a clarification, just as my supervisor does when I use the word this. You must give the antecedent, she says, again and again. And by the way, I love my supervisor. She keeps me on track and on the ball. And so I found the video kind of funny, as I do some aspects of my academic journey. And the good news is I'm learning terms like social constructionism and what it means, and it's helping me to understand the world a whole lot better. Though I promise not to become too woke. Thank you. And if you found value from this, please remember to subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.